In the last two parts of our breakdown of the Kursk offensive, we covered both the initial Ukrainian cross-border advance and 3 waves of Russian counterattacks. If you haven't seen those yet, make sure to watch them first to understand how we got here. In short, Russian forces managed to push Ukrainians out of roughly half of territory they had secured in the Kursk region. However, the cost of doing so proved unbearable for the Russian grouping of forces north. Over the course of 4 months, 2 entire Russian Marine brigades were rendered combat ineffective, while more than half of all VDV forces, 2 divisions and 2 brigades, came dangerously close to the same state. To buy time to replenish their losses, in both manpower and vehicles, the Russian grouping of forces north has now been reinforced by 12,000 of Kim Jong-un's reportedly most capable soldiers, who had been well equipped and trained in Russia over the last 2 months. Now it's their time to shine. On December 14th, the floodgates opened. North Koreans attacked simultaneously in the area of Kruglinkoe, Pogrebki, Naidionov, and near recently captured Plekhovo, moving in large chaotic formations through the snowy fields towards Ukrainian positions. What is interesting is that Russians apparently did not provide their allies with any armored vehicles, nor teach them to move in small infantry groups. Therefore, quite predictably, North Korean troops employed tactics from their last war that ended in 1953, attacking in large human waves. Ukrainians immediately employ FPV drones, as well as probably the most appropriate weapons to counter such tactic, cluster munitions. Such 155mm shells, as well as cluster GMLRS rockets, quickly devastate North Korean ranks, while drones no longer have to search for targets, instead picking and choosing whom to take out on the open terrain. Even seeing how their allies sustain mass casualties, the Russians do little to assist them, as fields where they used to attack in mechanized columns are quite literally covered by hundreds of killed North Korean soldiers, a massacre not seen since the times of Battle of Bakhmut. Together with that, it would be unfair to say that the assaults were entirely without results. DPRK troops pushed Ukrainians from many positions on the northern flank of the salient, where Russians were unable to achieve any breakthroughs for months. In response, Ukrainians redeployed the 144th Infantry Brigade to the salient to let the 22nd Mechanized Brigade reinforce positions there, together with operatives of the elite 73rd Naval Center of Special Operations and Rangers. Elements of the 8th Special Operations Regiment, which are also seen across the salient, focus their efforts around Kruglinkoe, clashing with and killing dozens of North Koreans in quick attacks that leverage communication hurdles between Russians and their new allies. Meanwhile, Russian assaults also continue, in particular in the notorious area of Zelený Shlях on the western flank. There, the Russian 34th Motor Rifle Brigade and a few other regiments arrived to support VDV forces after their extremely costly but pointless assaults. By December 18th, using overall increased pressure on Ukrainians, Russians also make minor gains near Zelený Shlях and Plekhovo. The next day, they drive a wedge in Ukrainian positions in the northwestern part of the salient, as well as close on Martinovka. In an attempt to slow down the advance, Ukrainians intensify strikes on Russian command posts, destroying one in Rylsk on December 20th. On December 21st, Ukrainians continue to lose positions near Plekhovo as Russians take a foothold in Kirillovka. At the same time, attempts to cross the border here are stopped. By that time, Russians apparently decide to change the way they use North Koreans, because a week of human wave assaults annihilated a big fraction of the whole force. Thus, from now on, DPRK units, which apparently were deployed and acted as 4 separate brigades, are slowly withdrawn, atomized and placed under the command of the Russian units. This way, they are still used as purely expendable troops and continue to take heavy losses, but at least the media effect from hundreds of eliminated North Koreans in open fields is mitigated. No DPRK soldiers were also taken as prisoners despite Ukrainian forces entering close-quarter combat with them, which is pretty easy to explain. Language barrier as well as ideological training, thanks to which North Koreans allegedly believe that they are fighting American and South Korean troops in Kursk, make surrender among DPRK troops almost impossible. Evidence shows that they would much more readily take their own life with a hand grenade in any desperate situation. On December 23rd, Ukrainians reinforced the Zelený Shlях area with a battalion of 116th TTF Brigade, likely to free up forces to mitigate a dangerous wedge to the north. However, by December 22nd, Russians, mostly using Koreans for one-way assaults, further expanded. On December 25th, Ukrainians answered by destroying the command post of what was left of the Russian 810th Marine Brigade in Lvov with GMLRS rockets. These strikes killed the deputy commander of the brigade, Salim Pashtov, as well as other officers of the unit. By December 30th, Ukrainians slightly improved their positions in Kruglinkoe, where Russians had earlier created a small wedge towards Malaya Loknya. By the next day, the wedge is fully liquidated as Ukrainian 8th Special Operations and 6th Ranger Regiments launched multiple converging assaults, taking out most of the North Korean troops holding it, with the help of drones. On the eastern flank of the salient, both Russians and Ukrainians have certain success assaulting positions of each other as elements of the Ukrainian 67th Mechanized Brigade arrive here. The year ends with Ukrainians more or less stabilizing the situation in Kursk region after quite chaotic and bloody battles, with a mix of Russian and North Korean troops in the second half of December. The strike with Storm Shadow missiles in Lvov on this day also kills 8 and wounds 22 officers of BDV, among whom a Chief of Division Communications Valery Tereshchenko, commander of the Engineering Battalion Pavel Maletsky from the 76th Division, and Deputy Chief of Staff Ali Tsurov from the 104th Division. On January 2nd, the command post of the 810th Marine Brigade is attacked, this time in Ivanovskoye, right during the ceremony where Russian officers were receiving awards. Even though the brigade is less active due to heavy losses, its command was likely playing a big role in the overall planning of grouping operations. The next day, the Russians advanced back to recently lost positions near Sudzha. They also continuously tried to establish pontoon bridges for their VDV forces in Daryino area, as their focus shifts to attempts to create an encirclement out of the Ukrainian salient by advancing into Sumy region. Meanwhile, Ukrainians are also eager to attack after repelling hundreds, if not thousands, of Russian assaults in the course of the last 4 months. Having limited reserves and a much more lower tolerance for losses, they prepare for counterattack much more rigorously than the Russians. Ukrainian command chooses to acquire the prioritized part of the front line, attacking from the southern part of Cherkasskoye-Porechnoye, while avoiding mined roads. The first ones to go are Bergepanzer II engineering vehicles with mine plows that create a corridor for the rest of the attack force. All armor, tanks, strikers, and MRAPs are covered in cages with elastic nets, as well as have a new jamming equipment. Thus, no vehicles are lost to mines, and radio-controlled FPV drones of the Akhmat regiment mostly fall to the ground upon approaching the column. Fiber-optic FPVs still score hits, destroying 3 strikers, M577 and a few MRAPs, according to the footage, but this is about all Russians can do. The column arrives at the village of Berdin, allowing the infantry to disembark and enter brutal combat with Russian infantry. Overall, Ukrainians have managed to advance 2.5 kilometers forward with minimal losses in a drone-dominated environment, showing that with proper reconnaissance and equipment, it's still possible to conduct limited attacks. Berdin, however, remains in Russian hands as Ukrainians retreat from it after brutal close-quarters combat, taking positions in nearby tree lines. Eventually, by January 6th, Russians in a number of costly assaults recapture most of the positions Ukrainians took here, even though certain buffer zone east of Cherkasskoye-Porechnoye remains in Ukrainian hands. As we mentioned fiber-optic FPVs, it's also a good time to talk about their effectiveness. First of all, their ability to bypass jamming and fly long distances is certainly a remarkable leap forward. Ukrainians play catch-up here, already using their own kind of such drones developed by specialists of the Birds of Magyar unit, but more time for mass production is needed. Together with all the advantages, fiber-optic drones are also slower, and their warheads tend to be slightly smaller due to necessity to carry extra spools of fiber optic itself. Despite the large amount of footage published by Russians, they tend not to show the aftermath of the strikes from the second drone, which hints that not every hit is successful. It's especially relevant for vehicles such as Leopard 2s, Challengers and Bradleys, which by no means are invincible, but can survive dozens of hits from radio and fiber optic FPVs, especially if equipped with nets and jammers. A good example of this is not only the video of Bradley surviving the hits during missions we covered earlier, but also the following footage. Here we can clearly see an immobilized and abandoned Bradley IFV, which is hit by Russian fiber-optic FPV drone from the side. The drone operator misidentifies Bradley as Marder in video captions and also aims not at the side armor itself, but the block of Brad reactive armor shielding it. The first drone either loses connection or deals no damage, though the Russians send another one. The second FPV detonates, likely hitting armor at a better angle, but what the third drone actually shows is that only one segment of reactive armor was destroyed while the Bradley hull remains intact. For some reason, Russians claim a kill here, even though it's not, but to be fair, with such activity of drones, it's unlikely the vehicle was evacuated. Nevertheless, what this footage shows is that the era of armored vehicles and tanks is not over. It's rather the era of poorly designed armored vehicles and tanks, which had slight chances before, is actually over. Russians also continued their attacks suffering heavy losses in exchange for small land gains. Their planning relies so much on numerical superiority and nothing else that sometimes simply unthinkable scenarios happen. For example, while Ukrainians were storming Berdin to the west of Russkoye Porечnoye, either Russians or North Koreans launched their attack, as a result of which a few infantrymen ended up stranded in the open field. The striker IFV of the 80th Air Assault Brigade, likely being out of ammunition, quite literally circles around them, trying to run over the adversary infantry. At least 2 soldiers are taken out this way, once again demonstrating how little support one-way Russian assaults can have. On January 7th, Russians enter Makhnovka to the south of Sudzha. We rarely visit this front line here, as Russians rely on the same tactic, making only slight progress here and there. But this progress accumulated over months means that they got closer and closer to Ukrainian supply lines that go through Sudzha. Ukrainian command also understands that, redeploying here the 33rd Assault Regiment, which expanded from the battalion that took part in the initial breakthrough in August 2024. Similar situation happens near Daryino. Russians constantly attack with various VDV regiments, usually taking heavy casualties, but infiltrating behind the river in this area. By January 8th, Russians also dangerously approach Malaya Loknya, so the 17th Heavy Mechanized Brigade conducts a number of assaults in Syrskyi, which is mostly in the grey zone. Overall, constant assaults of North Koreans and Russians in this area start without less losses and more gains, possibly due to exhaustion of Ukrainian brigades holding it. Even though Ukraine concentrated here both well-equipped and motivated troops, recently reinforced with at least 1 battalion of the 92nd Assault Brigade, they were under constant pressure for the last 3 months, also losing men and equipment due to the high activity of drones. For example, if we take 47th Mechanized Brigade, mostly equipped with American armored vehicles and tanks, it lost 3 M1 Abrams tanks throughout this period, which may seem insignificant as the Russians can easily lose as many tanks in a single mechanized assault. However, note that brigades operates only 30 tanks of this kind, all that US has managed to provide, and has already lost 15 M1 tanks before the Kursk incursion. So, its total tank losses are 60% of the total strengths. Together with that, being the main user of M2 Bradleys, the brigade lost 20 of these IFVs for the same time period. The losses of the other units, mostly using Soviet equipment, are likely higher, not just in vehicles but also in men, because almost all Bradleys and Abrams tanks were successfully abandoned by crews after critical damage, which is often not the case for T-64 tanks or BMPs. On January 10th, Russians also tried to infiltrate through the Ukrainian border to the west of the salient. First, the BTS-4 armored engineering vehicles tried to destroy the anti-tank ditch, but is quickly burned down by drones. Then, Russians for some reason bring the single up-armored MTLB to the area, which is also destroyed by drones. So, despite how dangerous 2 conversion strikes through the border can be for Ukrainian grouping, the Russian command still heavily prioritizes head-on assaults in the northern part of the salient, which mostly end with high losses and allow Ukrainians to retreat quite safely in case of possible encirclement. Something like that happens when Russians and North Koreans conduct heavy assaults of Russkoye Porечnoye with moderate success. Russian aviation, which just a few months ago was actively dropping hundreds of OMPK glide bombs on the Ukrainian positions, is also forced to decrease the number of sorties due to bad weather, which results in significant icing on aircraft. On January 11th, the first North Korean soldiers are taken as prisoners by servicemen of the 95th Air Assault Brigade, as well as 8th Regiment of Special Operations Forces, after being wounded and apparently unable to resist. In contrast, Russians sometimes surrender by dozens in the Kursk region. It's usually linked to the insane orders they continue to receive, especially after breaking another deadline for pushing Ukrainians out of Kursk region completely. In January, the first North Korean heavy weapons also started appearing in the Kursk region. These are Bullseye 4 ATGM system, M1978 Koksan howitzers, and even a localized version of the Soviet Tor air defense system. This further highlights the slowly approaching shortages of equipment in the Russian army, as well as deepening cooperation between the countries. Sometimes, however, cooperation has unintended consequences, as the only seen North Korean Tor was actually destroyed by Russian FPV drone crew in the Kursk region and later labeled as Western-made radar in the disposal of Ukrainians. By January 16th, Russians continue assaults, once again trying to cross the border to the west of the salient. This time they bring 4 BMP-2s and 1 BMD, but the assault is again quickly curbed by FPVs. The Russian infantry eventually is forced to retreat without much territorial gains in the Sumy region. These repeated border attacks might serve diversionary purposes, but since they are thwarted mostly by a handful of drones, Ukrainians do not really redeploy any reserves here. Overall, January is characterized by a slowdown in Russian advances. Massive columns become less common in the Kursk region, while near Pokrovsk, Russians' seemingly unstoppable territorial gains also stall, likely since strategic reserves prepared for further assaults on the key Donbass city are tied down in the north. It does not mean, however, that massive assaults do not happen at all. On January 19th, Russians used slightly modified tactics, splitting their armor into 3 groups that apparently have different destinations. One group of 3 BMP-3s has to disembark infantry near the tree line south of Malaya Loknya. Upon arrival, however, armored vehicles faced drones of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, which in a matter of minutes cause catastrophic explosions in each vehicle. This happens because BMP-3, which is meant to rival Bradley, has extremely weak armor on its sides, and in most cases is filled with 100mm shells for its main gun, which is supposed to be a key advantage. However, it so drastically reduces crew survivability that most of the vehicles are enveloped in flames long before they can even make first shots. The next group is likely stopped with landmines and artillery, so the Russian infantry has time to retreat. Quite soon, their 2 BMP-3s are finished off by drones, same as the T-80 BVM that was lagging behind even though it survived a few hits from FPVs before, and likely was supposed to be on the spearhead of the attack. 2 BMP-3s reached Syrskyi just to face more drones that once again caused catastrophic detonations, with no survivors in each vehicle. This way, yet another Russian mechanized assault ends without any territorial gains. Meanwhile, Ukrainians with forces of the newly arrived 33rd Assault Regiment pushed Russians back in Makhnovka, improving their positions. On January 20th, despite multiple thwarted assaults, Ukrainian troops remain mostly on positions along Malaya Loknya River. This mimics the situation in other parts of the western flank of the salient, where the Snagost River also plays an important role in how the Ukrainian defense in a situation of sharp deficit of men is structured. Trying to regain positions next to the river near Sudzha, Ukrainians also advanced in the area of Makhnovka by January 24th. On January 28th, 225th Assault Battalion is expanded into regiment. Inside the salient, the Ukrainian command also redeploys the 210th Assault Regiment Berlingo. Together with the 33rd Assault Regiment, also recently expanded, these form something unofficially called Syrsky's Assault Guard. All because the idea to form smaller than brigades and highly specialized assault units belonged to the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Alexander Syrskyi. The beginning of the Kursk offensive was a proof of concept, since 225th and 33rd Assault Battalions were capable of deploying quickly and covertly, and at the same time attack exactly where Syrskyi needed. Larger brigades, with their own staff and degree of autonomy, received more general orders to hold and advance into the area, but surgical strikes had to be executed by smaller units. Exactly for such strikes, Syrskyi, who often resorts to micromanagement of critical parts of the front line, grew his assault guard. He is often criticized for that, since his predecessor, Valery Zaluzhny, intervened way less into the work of subordinates and gave a wide degree of autonomy. However, it's important to remember that Syrskyi and Zaluzhny operated in completely different situations, and thus faced different challenges. Syrskyi in particular inherited an army with serious manpower shortages, and a very problematic life cycle of new brigade formation. So, as long as assault regiments under the direct command of the commander-in-chief are capable of performing tasks and inflict disproportionate losses on the adversary, it's hard to criticize them. Once again reinforcing the importance of terrain, by the end of the month, the Russians are able to advance mostly in the area between the rivers of Snagost and Malaya Loknya, after a number of brutal assaults. Now, as surprising as it is, half of the year has passed since the beginning of Ukrainian Kursk incursion. Throughout December and January, the greatest single change was the involvement of North Korean troops in direct combat. What's interesting is that over the last few weeks of January, these were mostly withdrawn from Kursk front line. The single believable reason for that is mass casualties, which wore down the 12,000-man strong grouping to the point of combat ineffectiveness. As we mentioned, the first human wave attacks of North Korean troops were disastrous for them, but the situation likely did not improve once these were atomized and subordinated to regular Russian army units. With little regard to the lives of fellow soldiers, which were demonstrated by continuous suicidal assaults, Russian commanders had even less concern for their new allies and simply annihilated them against Ukrainian defenses, which returned the situation to the status quo by the end of January. It is clear that soldiers Kim Jong-un sent have little in common with true special operations forces, but they were still mostly young and motivated men with prior service experience. To use them effectively, Russians only needed to teach their new allies how to fight in battlefield dominated by drones, how to move in small groups, employ FPVs for strikes, and operate reconnaissance UAVs. Yet, despite at least a month on Russian training grounds, their first attacks showed quite clearly that the training was never provided. And the results were predictable, with approximately a quarter of grouping being killed and wounded in the second half of December. However, DPRK troops were learning, and later footage shows them operating FPVs and reconnaissance drones in a proper manner, as well as testing some of their own gear, such as Bullseye 480GM system. Even though it happened only after heavy losses, the introduction of North Koreans and their adaptation still allowed Russians to withdraw depleted Marine brigades and other units, while further increasing pressure on Ukrainians. This in turn led to further territorial gains. In addition, the lessons that survivors of the Kursk carry home may one day reshape the way North Korea fight wars far beyond Ukraine. As of the end of January, the Ukrainian-held salient into Kursk shrank roughly to 400 square kilometers, after being over 1,000 square kilometers at its peak. Despite continuous pressure, Russia did not manage to achieve at least local rapid breakthroughs, as in the first counterattacks against the salient, mostly due to Ukrainians doing solid work with fortifications and mining, as well as keeping the pressure high with drones. What's interesting is that Russians continued to supply their grouping of forces north with the best equipment they could get in a situation of not just looming, but quite real armor shortages. When we were discussing the assaults, where the Russians lost 7 BMP-3s almost simultaneously due to drones and landmines, on the other parts of the front line, they were seen driving into head-on assaults, literally on civilian cars. This clearly shows that Kursk is prioritized the same as Pokrovsk, if not more. The advance there, by the way, significantly slowed down, and this is what we are referring to as a strategic effect of the Kursk offensive. There was quite significant time lag, and the halt is not complete, while the situation for Ukrainians there looks much better than in the summer or fall 2024. One of the speculations, which we see as plausible, is that one of the goals of the Kursk incursion was to ultimately exchange the captured land for something, or at least use it as a leverage during negotiations. Yet, since early 2025, it has become evident that peace talks pushed by the new US administration are a true zero-sum game for Ukraine and Russia. Kursk carried the potential to be card for both Ukrainians and Americans in discussions with Russia, but the White House's decision to avoid pressure in Moscow stripped it of any value. In the end, such zero-sum game left both sides holding just zero. So, the battle shall continue.